So thanks everyone for taking the time out of your day to be here and learn a bit about intersectionality and how we might bring it to implementation science. Before I start, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm presenting today from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people and wanted to express my gratitude to the original caretakers of this land and my own commitment to continuing to take care of the beautiful place where I get to live. So today we'll start with kind of where intersectionality originated and its key concepts. We'll get maybe a little bit uncomfortable and talk about reflexivity and the role that that can play in the work that we're doing. And then we'll move on to where implementation science and intersectionality might come together. And finally, talk about some ideas for some practical steps forward. So intersectionality originates in the work of Black feminist scholars and activists. And in particular, the concept was first discussed by Kimberly Crenshaw in her 1989 University of Chicago Legal Forum paper. And she brought this up kind of as a critique of, or an acknowledgement of the limitations of traditional feminist and anti-racist theories, which often considered just single axis perspectives. So considering gender only or race only, rather than how the two might come together to influence the experiences of women of color. So before we kind of unpack that a little bit more, just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page with a lot of the words that I might throw around in the presentation. Since I know as a sociologist, it's annoying when we're like, social this, social that. So just quickly, and apologies that this isn't the most exciting part, but when we talk about social identity, we mean, who you are, your self-concept, and that's usually derived from the social groups that you see yourself as belonging to. Social location is kind of your position within society based on how those different identities come together. Social structure is the way people and groups are organized in society. And you can think of that in terms of like different roles and relationships between people and groups and institutions. Social system is the broader network of interconnected structures, institutions, and relationships within a society that collectively shape our experiences. And then there's these four, power. So basically, the ability to influence someone or something else. And in terms of intersectionality, we're going to talk about how different elements of a person's identity can affect their standing and influence in society. Privilege, so those unearned advantages or benefits afforded to individuals based on who they are. Oppression, when individuals or groups are systematically mistreated based on who they are. This is something that is happening at like kind of a higher level. And then discrimination is more of that interactional component where people are treated unfairly based on perceived differences, and that leads to disparities in opportunities and outcomes. So now that we have those out of the way, we can get into intersectionality more specifically. So intersectionality refers to the interconnected nature of social categorizations within systems of power and privilege in different contexts and over time. What this means is that as individuals, we occupy many different social identities at once. And because we are not one thing, but many things, we can experience both advantage and disadvantage. And whether we experience one or the other can often depend on kind of where we are and when we're talking about. And finally, who is more likely to experience advantage or privilege and disadvantage, how often, when, and where is largely shaped by broader sort of institutions, policies, norms, and power dynamics happening in society. So one way to visualize this is in terms of looking at it as kind of like a wheel. So this is just one example. Definitely not exhaustive in terms of all the words that are up there, but just a way to think about it. So in the middle, we have the individual's person and their unique circumstances of power, privilege, and identity, and how these things sort of unfold over the course of one's life is also taking place within this sort of broader context of forms of power and oppression, and then an even broader within embedded within social structures and systems. So to get into it a little bit further, often when we talk about intersectionality, we first talk about intersecting categories and those like social identities. And I think that's a pretty kind of intuitive part of it. It's easy to think about, who we are and kind of the many different identities that we embody and what that looks like for us in society. But where it gets complicated, I think, is trying to get at some of those higher level sort of things and how do we operationalize those. So it's important to note that intersectionality it's not just those intersecting identities, but rather those are the experiences we have as a result of our identities are actually a reflection of things going on at higher levels. So intersectionality prioritizes multi-level analysis, meaning that we're looking at how factors are interconnected and influencing experiences. And that's at the individual or micro level, and then even higher in terms of groups, organizations, communities, and then even higher at societal structures, institutions, and systemic patterns. So kind of zooming out to see the bigger picture of where individuals are kind of situated. Building on the definition of power I offered a couple slides ago, intersectionality maintains that power is in everything. It's in from how we talk about things to how society is set up. And as such, it shapes our knowledge, our experiences, the roles and categories, we see for ourselves and others, and again, how advantage or privilege and disadvantage are distributed in society. Next is the concept of time and space. So a lot of what we have going on today and some of our power dynamics and things that are embedded in our institutions actually have deep roots in history, which also explains why they're often so ingrained in society and can be so difficult to change. At the same time, our experiences of power dynamics in relation to who we are can change over time and also as we age. It can also be different depending on the space that we're occupying. So that can be geographical, like where you live, if you're in downtown Ottawa or out in a rural area, and it can be social. So the things that you experience and how you navigate the world and how people treat you based on how they perceive you, that can look different depending on whether, whether I'm at work in the hospital or whether I am at the grocery store in the middle of nowhere or whether I'm at a pub with my friends. Next concept is diverse knowledges. So this just means that intersectionality embraces that there are many different ways of knowing things. So that means not only different epistemological standpoints, but also recognizing that there are different indigenous knowledges and different ways of knowing things through experience. And traditionally, the perspectives of people who are the most marginalized in society have been left out of knowledge creation and dissemination. And so intersectionality seeks to bring these voices back into the conversation. And bigger one, which starts to get us a little iffy maybe, is social justice. So some intersectionality scholars maintain that you cannot apply intersectionality to your work unless you're also incorporating a social justice element. Others say, it's not necessary to have a social justice piece. I think, like regardless of your approach, if you're interested in incorporating intersectionality to some extent in your work, you probably could share a concern with addressing inequity at some level. And I think regardless, we're interested in pursuing fairness, equity, and inclusion in society. But I think the degree to which we can do this depends on how willing and able we are to question the complex social and power relations that exist in the world that we live in. So this means we might have to get reflexive. And reflexivity is another concept in intersectionality. And I just wanted to kind of like tease it out and present it separately, because I think it's something that can often be overlooked or dismissed as like hippie woo woo or like whatever. But it's actually important, I think, to be able to be reflexive in order to do this work in a meaningful way, and to pursue those broader goals of equity and inclusion. So reflexivity involves self-awareness and self-reflection. This means taking a look in the mirror and thinking about how your own experiences of privilege or marginalization might impact your work, and understanding and questioning any assumptions or internalized biases that we might have kind of based on our own lived experience. So one simple way that you can start to do some of this before you get into the work is thinking about, we can think about where we sit on a wheel like this as an example, showing different intersecting social identities and forms of power and oppression. You might think about what spaces you occupy. Are you mostly located towards that middle circle? Are you straddling kind of a couple different rings? Are you mostly around the outer edge? And ultimately kind of starting to think about, there are some pieces of this wheel like that we occupy. There are many pieces that we don't, which means everyone experiences the world in different ways. And it's important to consider the possibility, especially if you're mostly existing within this sort of like inner circle. It's important to consider the possibility that other people's experiences are different from our own. And so the approach that we take when we're doing our research and practice, it might be missing something. And that's because the nature of privilege means that we are often not aware of the barriers that exist for other people, simply because they're just not part of our experience, right? They're invisible to us. So, just to give an example of, before we get into kind of like what this looks like in implementation science, if you think back to like the pandemic and, the introduction of vaccine certificates or the vaccine passport, if you were going out to dinner with your friends, did you have to worry about whether the name and gender on your vaccine certificate matched that which was on your new driver's license? If you were going, and how someone might treat you when they notice that discrepancy and you had to explain it. If you were going to get your second or third dose of the vaccine and the name and gender in the system did not match your new health card and driver's license, did you have to worry about the nurse stopping everything and calling everybody over while holding up a big line of people who were confused about why they weren't being able to get their vaccine in a timely fashion because they couldn't figure out what to do with you? There was no way to change it or no process for it. And so that's something like that as a trans person who transitioned during the pandemic that I experienced. I also have privilege in that I have the resources to be able to deal with stuff like that. But it's an example of the unintended consequences of interventions when they are implemented without considering the potential impact they can have on people who are different from us. Okay, so that was like kind of heavy. So I just wanted to have a smile break. This is my duck, Dewey, and his excellent hair. So hopefully you feel a little bit lighter. And we can talk more about, intervention, designing and implementing interventions, and what that looks like when we're thinking about intersectionality. And in full disclosure, I'm not an implementation scientist. I'm a sociologist. But broadly, if we're talking about implementation science, I think at its core, it's not so different from intersectionality in that both of these fields are just going for transformation. They just want to change stuff for the better. They just want to make things better for people. And I think that, sometimes they do it in different ways, but I think that they can be complementary um, in how we ultimately try to do these things. So just to give a definition of implementation science, I'm thinking of it as in terms of like how we're moving evidence into the real world to change practice or behavior and improve outcomes, like whether that's like a individual health outcome or how an individual provider, does their job, or how a hospital department supports the well-being of their staff, something like that. And largely it is, we're focusing in on how to get people, individuals to do something or how to get them to stop doing something. But I think, when sometimes if we're so focused on like individuals and changing the behavior of individuals, it's easy to forget the broader context in which they are living and working. And I mean, I'm like not surprised, like it's hard, right? Like it's these are big questions and big problems. And implementation science is complicated and hard enough. So if we're thinking about social identities and structures and all of those things, it's just like often not evident what we can do about it. But I think the first step is recognizing that they exist and are important rather than always, defaulting to a one size fits all approach. And so that's where I think the two fields can really come together. And, if we bring them together, we might be able to sometimes, better tailor or target our interventions and our approaches to the work that we're doing. We might be able to better identify and strategically address barriers and enablers. We might be able to reduce disparities in access to a particular intervention and to make sure that the outcomes of it are equitable. We might be able to design interventions that specifically actually target and try to reduce some inequities. And we at least might be able to reduce or avoid altogether unintended consequences of our interventions in terms of making sure that they don't exacerbate existing inequalities or create new ones. Fourth, we might just get better data. We might be able to think about factors, that normally we might not have thought about and get a more holistic understanding of what's going on with the group we're working with or the intervention that we're trying to implement. We might be able to contribute to more inclusive policies. So, generating evidence based on the diverse experiences of different people, and then that can be used to support decision-making at a higher level. And then there is the issue of sustainability. So, if we can enhance the effectiveness of our interventions over the long term by, developing interventions for problems that can work for different people and in different settings. And part of this ensuring lasting impact is looking at systemic issues. So if we can try to start to recognize some of those things, we might be able to have interventions that work for the long run. And just as an example, some of the work that we did on teamwork in barriers enablers to teamwork in the operating room, we actually found that like gender and sometimes it's intersection with like age and level of experience, which were closely related in surgery, and sometimes race, really played a big role. So we would hear things like a young woman resident, physician in training, would voice a safety concern during surgery, and the attending surgeon, who was a man and often older and white, would dismiss the concern or just ignore it. And it would take another resident of the same level of experience, but this time a man, to say the exact same thing. And then the attendant surgeon would be like, oh, yes, like we need to do something about it. Like, why didn't anyone tell me about it? Blah, blah, blah. So you can kind of start to imagine, if you want to design something to help improve teamwork in the operating room, maybe like a structured communication protocol for how to raise and escalate a safety concern, it might not be optimally effective if kind of all of this other stuff is going on in the background. Of course, addressing that other stuff is like the $1 million question. I don't really have answers for you yet, but there are some places potentially to start. So recent publication, just thought I would flag, is this checklist for application of intersectionality in health interventions and programs. And so what the authors have done is sort of come up with this series of questions to ask at each stage of the process. So, from identifying the problem to designing and implementing the intervention to evaluating its effectiveness, there's some questions that can be raised to try to bring these concepts of intersectionality into each part, which is a good exercise to go through if you have time. It helps you to really get in the mindset and think about these things. But I think, at the criticism of intersectionality is, of course, it's just some of the stuff is just like, maybe not practical all the time or feasible. I mean, this list it's 38 questions, which is still better than I did when we worked on the TDF, enhancing the theoretical domains framework with intersectionality, because I think there was like 60 questions for that, which, speaks to the complexity of intersectionality, but also like, I think we need to find probably better ways to try to do it, especially because, depending on the population that we're working with, or like the resources that we have and the time pressure that we're under, try to think through, 40, 50, 60 questions, probably not realistic. So I don't know, lately I've been thinking about what like some more like bite-sized chunks of intersectionality might look like, so that at minimum, we're thinking about things that are important or that will make a difference in the work that we're doing without like being overwhelmed. So far, I think probably bringing some elements of intersectionality in implementation science might look like, or might like revolve around these 4 words. And for me, those are understanding, engagement, adaptation, and action. And each of these words evokes just a couple of questions, which you could ask at the beginning of a project that you are designing. And those are: what intersecting social identities and structures might be relevant to the problem we want to address? How might our own social identities influence the implementation process? Have we engaged a diverse group of team members and stakeholders in the project? Are their perspectives actively considered in the planning, design, and decision-making processes? Are our implementation strategies flexible enough to accommodate the diverse needs and contexts of different social groups? How open is the team to feedback from diverse stakeholders, and how are practices adapted accordingly? What advocacy efforts can be undertaken to address identified structural inequities at the policy level? Are there opportunities for collaboration with relevant leaders or organizations to promote structural changes that support equity? And I know these last 2 questions are still kind of big, and are things that will take time. So in the meantime, while we're working towards those big things, there's probably also a couple small things that we can do probably almost every time that we are taking on a new project. And at least so for me, that looks like drawing on multiple sources of knowledge. So when you are, first kind of identifying and studying a problem, you're looking at both quantitative and qualitative sources. Are you looking at information across different fields? Are you talking to diverse groups of people? Are there voices that you can bring into the conversation? Might Indigenous knowledges be relevant? Basically just trying to kind of like broaden that perspective and consider kind of the different sides of the problem at hand. Next, trying to get, obviously as diverse and representative a sample as you can, but then when you're reporting the findings, disaggregating them amongst meaningful kind of categories rather than lumping everybody together and just assuming that things are working the same for everybody, because I mean often that is not the case, and there might be differences in how things are playing out. Contextualizing findings. So I think there's an opportunity in the discussion section of every manuscript to, when you're reporting on what you observed amongst the individuals in your studies, to relate that back to what's going on at that place and time, and ask questions like what is influencing what you observe. So if you weren't able to study some of these higher level factors, you can still talk about what might be relevant or what might be explain the differences in your findings, or what we might need to consider to move forward, or to scale up this intervention, or to make it more inclusive, or whatever. Trying to find ways to kind of situate individuals back within that larger context, because the reality is that individuals like don't live in a vacuum. Using inclusive language, so simple, but still hard, and not always done, but trying to use words correctly and with purpose, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. So I think, trying to questioning our own privilege and thinking about ways that like we might have internalized biases and how those might impact our work. And like we all have them, myself included. That can feel a little icky at first, and like maybe not great. And I think though that if you bother to do that work, it's a natural part of growth and learning. And I think people sometimes are hesitant to incorporate intersectionality because it's uncomfortable, or because they are afraid of offending someone, or they're afraid of getting it wrong. But I think it's probably better to just try and maybe make some mistakes, but then learn and do better next time. And that's probably a way we can really make progress in the work that we're doing. And finally, listening and learning. So just like for me, I mean, just like I think there's always value in listening and learning to and learning from as many different people as possible, and then bringing that into the work that you're doing. So just being open to new information and issues that are going on in the world, and trying to kind of like, again, broaden that perspective, to understand that the experiences that exist outside of your own, and that can only serve to, I think, enrich the work that we are doing. So I'll leave it at that. And yeah, questions?
Thanks so much, Cole. I'm seeing lots of clapping in people's Zoom boxes, and also just wanted to echo some comments in the chat box, which I share as well. And that is just an incredibly thoughtful presentation, very pragmatic and tangible, and really things that we can all implement in our practice day to day as we move through our work. So thank you.
Thank you.
In terms of questions, there aren't any questions in the chat box, but opening the floor up for anybody to put their hands up and take themselves off mute. Okay, well, I have a question, Cole. So thinking about our work, and particularly in resource limited settings, which of course our resources are always limited, I'm curious how you balance the need for inclusivity with the practical constraints of doing implementation work.
Yeah, so I think that is definitely one of the big challenges. And I mean, and one that ultimately requires changes at a systemic level to allow researchers to the time and space to do this work, and the funding to do this work, and recognizing that it does take time, which might look like less publications or whatever. But in the meantime, I think there are a couple things we can do. So we can definitely like prioritize key factors. So thinking through the literature and you know, the stakeholders on your and team members perspectives, and identifying like what kind of identity and like structural factors might be most relevant to this problem, or which ones do we want to really make sure that we're considering. And that, you know, I think that goes hand in hand with trying to engage a diverse team and community members and people with lived experience where you can. I think there's just so much value in having like different people around the table who might like raise something that like you might not have thought of. There might be ways, I haven't thought this through, but I think there might be ways to like embrace technology in trying to do some of this work. And then finally, I think just building the building a foundation or like capacity building, so that like as this becomes part of your regular practice, it probably gets easier to do it. And even if you're in a pinch, so even if you have limited resources or time, if you're used to thinking about these things or doing these things, it's like actually takes like won't take as much effort after a while, so it might be like less resource intensive in the long run.
Thanks, cool. Absolutely appreciate that reflection. Okay, so we have some more questions in the chat box. So first from Jamie. Jamie, I'll just read your question out loud if that's okay. So Jamie says, I think a big challenge with this work is operationalizing it into measurable, quantifiable outcomes. Are there tools or techniques for measuring outside of a 38-point questionnaire? And then there's a follow-up comment. Part of the challenge being researchers don't do it because they don't know where to begin, and funding agencies often aren't equipped with reviewers who can offer valid and fair assessment.
Yeah, so great questions. And I think you know, these come from how we usually think about things, which is we want to like be able to measure and quantify things, and certainly value in doing that, and certainly something that we need to do. At the same time, I might suggest that you know, if we're building this into our work in terms of thinking about, you know, what social identities and structures might be relevant to the question at hand, and how might we make sure that we are being, you know, inclusive in our work and that kind of thing. I'm not sure if there's necessarily like an outcome of that in the traditional sense of like I think it's you know, we might talk about whether we did it well, we integrated it well, but I think like the point of doing it is so that, you know, the outcomes of our work, whether that is like, you know, improving a health outcome, you know, for example. I think the health outcome is what we're actually measuring, but then we want to make sure that like that people who are the health outcome, like the benefits are experienced by everybody or as many people as possible, right? Like, so our intervention is considering how what that like what health might look like, or how we get to that health outcome for different groups of people, and considering that that might look different for different groups of people. And so I don't really know, like, yeah, I'm not an expert in like process evaluation, but I think that's probably where that comes in. I think the point of the questions is more just to you know, start thinking through what might be relevant to the project that you're working on, in terms of like whose experiences might you need to be considering when you're designing your intervention, or what might you want to look at to ensure that it's generating equitable outcomes.
Thanks, cool. Okay. And then we have another question from Stacy, who shares that this is really thought-provoking content. The question, can you speak a bit about the tension between research/science being objective and value-free, and your suggestion that intersectionality as a research area is expected to take on a position in favor of social justice or equity?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, and just to clarify, like I don't think not everyone maintains that you know, social justice is like expected. But I think, you know, this tension is something that's kind of like built into how research is structured. And I myself am probably a little biased because I don't think that it's possible to just be value free. But I think what it is possible to do is reflect on what those values or positions are and how they might be influencing your work in order to mitigate the potential bias that they might have on your work. So I think there's steps we can do to try to like make sure that bias isn't showing up. And that's a good thing. I think that but I also think like, probably as researchers, I think like most, or like in practitioners, like I don't think people got in this work to make things worse for people. So I think the whole social justice equity thing, like, isn't that what we're doing? I don't know. I'm not sure that there is research and like practice in healthcare that seeks to like not like to be against those things. So I don't think it's I don't think, I'm not saying that like every implementation science has to go like march on Parliament Hill with their research and a flag or something, but I think just by virtue of like doing the work that you're doing and then trying to build some of these other considerations in, whether you're explicitly saying you're addressing equity, social justice or not, like you maybe probably are contributing to it. So, and that's probably good.
Thanks, Paul. Any other questions?
I'm wondering, do you have other just like examples that you can tell us about? You talked a little bit about the like the operating room example and how bringing intersectionality lens could help potentially with that situation, but any other stuff like projects that you've worked on where it's like, these things have led to a good outcome, or just any interesting anecdotes?
Yeah. So a lot of stuff came out of the teamwork stuff, but some of the, just thinking of area that I'm working in right now in terms of plasma donation and supporting people who want to donate plasma to be able to do that. There we do some work with gay, bisexual, and men who have sex with men who, in the past have been affected by policies that prevented them from donating blood, and which are no longer in effect. But there are different considerations for if you want to support a gay man in going to make a donation than if you were supporting like like a cisgender heterosexual person. And then we've been talking lately with our lived experience partners, to be a gay man who is also is gender diverse is a whole other thing when they're going into the donation center, because a lot of the forms still are very binary and used to ask some questions that were like kind of gross. So it's just like people, so it's just an example of like, if you want to support someone, there's like whole history of stuff that happened and how gay, bisexual men, sex men have been treated within the blood donation system. And then also, and even things that like maybe still happen when they go to donate. So those are some things to consider in trying to, help more people donate, which is a good thing. And we need more people to donate. But it just might look a little bit different for different people.
Thanks, Cole.
Any other follow-up questions, reflections? Okay. Well, thank you again for your presentation today. Oh, Maddie, please go ahead and share.
Hi, I was trying to type it out, but I couldn't type fast enough. I was just taking a peek at your article with the TDF framework and the applying an intersectionality lens. I'm planning to do an evaluation. I'm a PhD candidate at Dalhousie in Halifax, and we're looking at a model of care that has been implemented for infants diagnosed with neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome, and then their mothers or birth parents who have been diagnosed with opioid use disorder. So a marginalized population who have experienced, quite a bit of stigma, and then also that intersectionality is definitely present in this population. So I want to make sure that I bring that into my implementation science research. I was planning to use the CFIR just as a tool, I guess, in my analysis. And I was just curious what your thoughts were on applying some of the findings from that application of the intersectionality lens with the TDF to another framework.
Yeah, so part of the work that we did with the group that Danielle's a part of was looking at different models, theories, and frameworks and how intersectionality might be applied to them. And now I can't remember, Danielle, was the C4 one of them? Yes.
Yes, it was. And Maddie, I'll try and pull up the article now at the end here, but I'm happy to connect with Megan and email that to you as well.
Amazing. Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Overall, Cole, I would say in terms of the reflections from those different activities, I would say everything you've covered today also aligns with the reflection pieces included in those models, theories, and frameworks. So you're incorporating the reflections Cole shared today, reasonably incorporating those other models, theories, and frameworks as well that have been enhanced.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think it's just no matter what the framework is, I think it's just kind of asking those basic questions about, you know, whose voices are included and whose aren't, and who might maybe need to be thinking about when we're doing this work.
Thanks, Maddie. Wishing you all the best.